We are here to speak about climate refugee or refugee in general. And in this presentation, I want to stress two main issues. First, climate refugee is only a part of a much broader issue concerning all displaced persons for environmental reasons. And for all these people, whatever the origin of the migration, the right to life is a right to survive and is a right to escape from a disaster. And that's the common issue for all displaced persons, to escape from a disaster. And the second element is that neither migration law, environmental law, human rights law give them a legal protection. And everybody says there is a gap about legal status for displaced persons. And that's why a little group of research people in the University of Limoges, 10 years ago, as you said, both environmental lawyers and human rights lawyers decided to draft a draft convention on the issue. As you know, there is a big diversity of displacement causes: natural disaster, environmental degradation, technological disaster, mixed disaster as Fukushima, both natural and technological, development works, and specifically environmental protection policy. Because of environmental protection policy, there are people displaced for environmental reasons. For instance, the climate mitigation policy, and in the case of the Benes tribe from Uganda in Africa, expelled from its land to allow offsetting tree plantation, implementing Kyoto Protocol for coal installation in the Netherlands. So there has been displaced people for environmental protection. The data are numerous, and I won't give precise elements because there is a lot of figures on that and a lot of controversy. But some element from the High Commissioner for Refugees of UN: 1 centimeter of rising sea level gives 1 million of displaced persons. 1 centimeter, 1 million of people. And 25% of displaced persons are in Africa, and 80% are internal displacement. So what are the legal issues? Are environmentally displaced persons taken into account by international law today? The answer is no. There is a lack of legal protection in international law for displaced persons. And so how to give them a legal status? Well, the only way in international law is law. And so it's necessary to draft a new law on displaced persons for environmental reasons, giving them a legal status and a human rights-based approach. When you put this question, the first answer is, well, there is already the Geneva Convention of 1951 on refugee. But as everybody knows, the articles of the Geneva Convention are very precise, and the practice is very precise. A condition is the notion of persecution. And so how far displaced persons for environmental reasons are people persecuted? That's a controversy. I know that some people say, well, it's a kind of persecution, but not on the legal term. Then the Geneva Convention applies only when you cross a border. And we have seen 80% of displaced persons are internal displaced persons. So we could have an amendment to the Geneva Convention. But as you know, it's very complicated to have an amendment to an international treaty, mainly an old international treaty on a topic very sensitive today about refugees in Europe and everywhere in the world. So it would be, for diplomatic reasons, very dangerous to open negotiation for modification of the Geneva Convention today. So there is the way to talk only on internal displaced person, or there's a majority of the issue. As you know, there is, since 1998, a guiding principle, which are soft law guiding principles, but they are beginning to be applied more and more, and there are now 20 national laws applying specifically the UN guiding principles, but they are not binding. The only binding instrument about internal displacement is for Africa, the Kampala Convention, which is in force since 2012. So there is necessity to have an international binding instrument to protect environmentally displaced persons, and to give to these instruments a human rights approach. There has been several proposals for such conventions, and the project of Limoges began in the year 2005 in Limoges. There was a group of search people, and the first draft was published, and now we are with the third draft, because we try to modify the draft more and more. We receive some proposal, and you are open to give proposal to have a better draft, and it's a long process now, 10 years process of proposal. The first question about this draft convention was a question of the terminology. What would be the word used? Refugee, migration people, displaced person. We choose displaced person because at that time it was beginning more and more used by UN bodies, because it was neutral in comparison with refugee, which is specific for the Geneva Convention, and which has both political and legal signification. And in many cases it's used to climate refugee or climate displaced person. And we consider that the topic is not about the cause of the displacement. There are many causes of displacement: natural, technical, climate change. Climate change is one of the causes. There are many others. And in a human rights approach, the main issue is not the cause, it's a consequence. It's the issue for the people. For the people, whatever the cause, the issue is that they must leave their home. Whatever the explanation, whatever the responsibility, which is another topic, responsibility, is only we deal with the consequence of the displacement in human rights approach. And that's why we consider that the most broad wording was environmentally displaced person. And that's why we didn't propose a protocol to the Climate Change Convention because we consider it would close the issue only for a category of people. And what happened for the people of Fukushima, the displaced person of Fukushima? It's not a climate change displacement, and they suffer in their human rights issue. So we gave a definition. We can be discussed the definition. Which is a large definition, including not only individuals, as human rights do, they deal with individuals. We have a broader view for groups, for population. The objective and the principles. The objective is to guarantee the right of these people and to organize their reception and their eventual return. So, the scope of the convention, as it is now, is universal. Well, we could discuss, and it has been discussed for diplomatic strategy, if it was better to have a regional convention or a universal convention. Well, we are open for regional convention. We saw that the Kampala Convention in force is a regional convention. So why not? And nowadays there is a tendency in environmental law to have a regional convention. For instance, about the Paris Convention, they failed to have a universal convention for South America. And now South America is having its own Paris Convention. So why not a regional convention for displaced persons in Europe, in South America, in Africa? But the topic is universal and the answer should be universal. It's based on classical principles of human rights law and environmental law, principle of solidarity, principle of ecological assistance, which come from the point 18 of the Rio Declaration, and principle of effective protection, effective, not theoretical protection, effective protection, which is principle 7 from Rio Declaration. The general mechanism is that we try to give specific rights to environmental displaced persons so that they get a legal status. Then these specific rights for effective implementation is accompanied by institutional mechanisms to give a better effectiveness to the legal status. So it's a very, it seems very bureaucratic institutional mechanism. But the proof has been given in human rights law and in environmental law at international level that the international treaty which works, are the one with specific institution. The Human Rights Committee, the Compliance Committee in the International Convention on Environmental Law. Well, international law works when there is specific institution to help the implementation. So first, it's a right-based approach. Right to person. So there are no new rights. And that's why for states, it's not a revolution. It's not a new declaration of rights. It's just the rights already existing in the Human Rights Declaration of 48, in the two conventions of 71. They already exist. Information, participation, assistance, water, food, health, juridical personality, respect for family, right to return. Well, there is all the list in the convention. right to move freely, right to return home, right to permanent shelter, right specific for interstate displacement, with the principle of non-refoulement, which already exists in the Geneva Convention, right to return, right to conserve the nationality of origin, and specific right for families and population, preservation of unity family, right to maintain cultural specificity. Then the most important, because the list of the rights, they exist already. The most important is to give to the people specific status to be able to protect these rights in specific situations. So it's necessary to recognize a legal status. And for that, it's necessary to have a national commission with independent members which are competent to give this specific status. So we tried to go further than the Geneva Convention, because the Geneva Convention defined the refugee, persecution for political reasons, and then gives to each state the freedom to organize the procedural way to give the status of refugee. As you know, it's the most difficult, because there is a big difference between states to give the specific status of refugee. So there we want that the specific status for displaced person is not given to the states. It's organized by the international law. It's organized by the convention. So there must be a national committee to give the status. There is an appeal to a high authority, which is an international body, to get an harmonization of the rules to implement the legal status, to not have differentiation between states, to have an harmonization of the status. So the high authority at international level, national commission at national level, and the displaced person at national level. So the institutions are a world agency to give a political importance to the issue, which is a common issue. I was last May in Istanbul in the humanitarian summit of United Nations. In the humanitarian summit of United Nations, in this year of such many displaced persons, there was not a word on displaced person and legal issue. There was not a word. So it's really a tragedy, an international tragedy for UN and for the member states. And we are, as a little international NGO, we were the only one to speak about displaced person and to ask for a universal legal status, to ask to the states just to put on the agenda the topic of displaced person on international agenda, not to sign a treaty today. We know that it takes several years, but just to put it on the agenda, on a universal agenda. And the humanitarian summit was the occasion at UN level. Conclusion. There is a urgent humanitarian necessity. There is a necessity of specific institutions, because if you have not institutions in international law, you have not effectiveness. There should be a synergy which is asked by every report at New York, synergy between environmental law, human rights law, and humanitarian law. There is a topic of the synergy. Ban Ki-moon won the synergy. Give to Ban Ki-moon this instrument as an example of a synergy between international law, human rights law, and humanitarian international law. And there is a good occasion in international law with the International Law Commission work. You know the draft article on the protection of persons in the event of disasters, which is a wonderful work, saying that you must take into account human rights for persons in the event of disasters. It's not a revolution, it's just the law to take into account human rights in crisis situation. But it's written by the International Law Commission. I was last year in the Sendai meeting in Japan about international UN disaster strategy. Very interesting. That was the post-Kyoto strategy for resilience for disaster. A lot of papers, documents, a new strategy, the post-Kyoto strategy for disaster. We had to fight so that the topic of displaced person because of disasters be on the agenda and on the document. It was not an evidence. And what was incredible, that the official documents of the UN for that meeting on the disaster didn't mention the International Law Commission work on the protection of persons in the event of disaster, because the International Law Commission in Geneva, in the building B, and the disaster issue is in the building A, and they are not in the same building, in the UN institutions. And that's why they didn't know each other. So that's crazy. And so we must destroy the walls of the administration of UN so that the synergy exists. If you look at a very interesting document, which is a UNEP environmental law program. You know the UNEP in Nairobi, very far, but in the body for environmental agency protection. And in UNEP there is a unity on environmental law. And there is a program of UNEP on environmental law at international level, very interesting for lawyers, only interesting for academic lawyers. It's a Montevideo program. I was surprised to read in the Montevideo Program 4 of 2009 a line saying at the program of UNEP we will give a legal instrument for environmental displaced persons. So it's in on the program of work of UNEP to think about a legal instrument for displaced person for disaster. So when I saw that, I wrote immediately to UNEP Environmental Law Direction, saying, wonderful guys, we are working on the same topic. We want to draft, you want to draft something on displaced person. We already have the document. We can work together. I didn't receive any answer. I don't travel much. I didn't go to Nairobi to see the people. They didn't answer. So now there is the Climate Change Convention, which seems today to be the only international body having mentioned the issue of displacement. That's incredible. But since the COP16 in Cancun, the paragraph 14, there is a mention of displacement as a consequence of climate change. Just a word. There has been in the UN human rights body the CREPO report on migrants, which asked for an international agreement for environmental migrants. So that was asked by the special rapporteur, CREPO. There has been the European Parliament. I know that now European Parliament is nothing for it, but for me it's always an international democratic body. So the European Parliament, in a document before the Rio plus 20 meeting, made a resolution for the Rio plus 20 meeting. And in this resolution of the European Parliament, we succeeded to ask to the Green Party to put in the European Parliament resolution a mention there should be a convention on international displaced persons. So it's in the document. It was voted, adopted by the European Parliament. They asked for an international convention. And then the COP21, the Paris Agreement, paragraph 50, where they just say that in the specific group on loss and damage, there will be a specific group of a specific group with a specific group on the topic of displacement. But it is on a specific agenda of a specific group, of a specific loss and damage group. So we can think that in the next future it will be on the agenda, but unfortunately on the agenda of climate change. And for me, it's, I don't know in English, in French, it's an impasse. It's not an issue, an impasse, because it will solve not the problem. And quickly some state will say, well, guys, what we did is not only for climate change issue, it's the same for earthquake, it's the same for inundation, it's the same for any disaster. And they will have to begin again the work, because they will discover that it's the same issue for all disasters and not only for the climate change disaster. And our draft convention has been mentioned, that was on the PowerPoint, by a new French document. In last September, President François Hollande asked a group of lawyers, and I was a part, to draft a universal declaration on the right of humanity, saying that after the 48 Universal Declaration on Human Rights, today there should be a Universal Declaration on the rights of humanity, because today it's not only the right of man, it's the right of humanity, because it's a global issue. And so there is a document drafted, a new declaration on the right of humanity, which was given to President Hollande last September. And in this declaration, and there is an English version of the declaration, not only a French one, there is a paragraph on the rights of displaced persons, because it's not only a question of human rights, it's a question of humanity rights. And President Hollande gave to Ban Ki-moon in an official meeting last April the project of the Humanity Rights Declaration. So now it's on the table of United Nations, and it should be on the agenda of the General Assembly, and maybe one day it will become at the 48th Human Rights Declaration. And it will be a new step for human rights of displaced persons. Thank you very much.